after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under the custody of Hagag, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given to them, and let the young women who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away by Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is, Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in the custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what had happened to her. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulation for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointment for women. When the young women went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all of his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. And he granted a remission of taxes to the providences and gave gifts with royal generosity.
If you've grown up in church or as a person of faith or even somebody who watched VeggieTales as a child, you're probably familiar with the story of Esther, and it might be one of your favorites. I get it. It's one of mine too. But let me encourage you in the sessions ahead as we cover familiar text and stories that you know well. Ask God to give you a fresh perspective and a personal word as we seek to know him better through the study of Scripture. Chapter 1 begins in Persia in a time of great feasting. In fact, this particular feast that we will talk about is on the heels of what I would consider a season of feasting, a 180-day banquet. And these final 7 days will include comparable feast hosted by the king and queen for all the men and all the women of the kingdom. This is going to be a party. And this party is going to go out with a bang. King Ahasuerus is going to call for Queen Vashti at the end of this 7-day male feast, the one that has the opulent and the ordinary. There has been 7 days of feasting and merriment, and these men are likely inebriated very highly. Some scholars believe that the king was going to parade the queen without her clothes on, wearing only her crown. I wish we had more detail. Perhaps Vashti was scared. Maybe she was embarrassed. Maybe she was belligerent. Maybe she was bold. I wish we knew more about Queen Vashti, but for whatever reason, she refused the king's request. Now, for all we don't know about Queen Vashti, we can rest assured that she did know this was not going to go well for her, and it did not. This was a time when women had no agency. At that point in history and culture, she was not allowed to refuse the king. And what Vashti does really upsets the apple cart, so to speak. And all of the male advisors to the king are very concerned at the chain reaction that could take place because of Vashti's refusal to appear before the king. Vashti is then banished from the king's presence, and a royal decree is issued that she will never appear before the king again. In fact, all women everywhere will be made known of this and told to honor their husbands. So the king is feeling pretty confident that he's adequately headed off any consequence of Vashti's refusal, but he is still in a bind. He has no queen. So his advisors tell him to gather all of the young virgins and take them into royal custody. And Esther, known as her Persian name, Hadassah, her Jewish name, is included in this roundup. Esther's uncle, who has raised her, instructs her not to share of her Jewish heritage. And he goes every day by the royal courtyard to check on her. And what he observes is she is gaining favor. Remember how we talked last session about how God shows up behind the scenes in the book of Esther, even though he's not named? I think this is one of those areas God shows up by allowing Esther to gain favor in the palace and with all who saw her. But Esther doesn't just gain favor with everyone. She gains favor with the king. Scripture tells us that he loved her more than all the others. Now, you and I might take issue with what he calls love. It's likely a little more lustful than loving, but suffice it to say, he is taken with her and he makes her his queen. And then here's what I find interesting. He does something that makes the entire kingdom favorably inclined towards Esther. He grants a remission of taxes. He's generous and he throws a feast in her honor. So even those who may never have met her and seen her charm up close and personal seem to have a favorable opinion and idea of his new queen because of the benefit that they have gained personally. As we reflect on Esther chapter 1 and the first part of chapter 2, let's thank God for the ways that he moves on our behalf, sometimes visibly, but often behind the scenes. Our efforts to dig in and to discover where God has been at work in times past and where he's still working today in our lives, they are not in vain. It's an endeavor that's worth it.